The diner smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions, the kind of place where old love stories and tired travelers found rest. At a corner booth sat an elderly couple, Harold and Margaret. Their hands, wrinkled but warm, rested over each other's as they shared a plate of fries and a milkshake, just like they used to do in their youth. Every so often, Margaret would giggle softly at something Harold said, her silver hair catching the golden afternoon light streaming through the dusty window. It was their small ritual lunch at this roadside diner, every Sunday after visiting the park where they'd first met decades ago. The peace, however, didn't last long. The bell above the diner door jingled as a group of 4 young men stumbled in, their voices loud and careless. They wore flashy jackets, smelled of cheap cologne, and carried the kind of arrogance that thrived on making others feel small. They laughed too loudly, threw their jackets across the counter, and immediately disrupted the soft rhythm of the place. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, frowned slightly but said nothing. As they ordered burgers and milkshakes, one of the boys, tall, broad, with a smirk that never left his face, noticed the elderly couple in the corner. "Ah, look at them," he mocked loudly. "Date night at the retirement home." His friends burst into laughter. Margaret lowered her gaze, pretending not to hear. Harold clenched his jaw but kept still. He'd lived long enough to know that responding to cruelty often gave it power. But the young men didn't stop there. They found humor in the discomfort they caused. "Hey, old man," the tall one called out as he grabbed his glass of Coca-Cola. "Want a drink to stay young?" He walked toward the couple, grinning, while his friends watched eagerly. Before Harold could respond, the boy tilted the glass and poured the Coke down Harold's jacket. The cold liquid splashed onto the table, dripping into Margaret's lap. The diner fell silent. The laughter that followed was loud, cruel, and echoing, a sound that felt heavier than the soda soaking through Harold's clothes. Margaret gasped softly, her hand trembling as she tried to wipe her husband's sleeve with a napkin. Harold simply sat there, his eyes fixed on the table. There was anger inside him, yes, but also something deeper, sadness. Sadness that the world had changed so much that respect for age, for kindness, for simple decency, seemed to have vanished. The waitress rushed over with a towel, her voice shaking as she said, "Sir, I'm so sorry," but Harold just smiled faintly. "It's all right," he whispered. "Some lessons life will teach them one day." Margaret looked at her husband with quiet pride. Despite the humiliation, he stayed composed, calm, even gentle. Neither of them knew that lesson was about to arrive much sooner than anyone expected, because at that very moment, a familiar figure was pushing open the diner's door, stepping into the chaos with a calm strength that could silence any storm. Story by Pure Hub Kindness. The bell above the diner door chimed again, a soft, metallic sound that sliced through the uneasy silence. Everyone's eyes turned, some curious, some nervous, as a man in his early 30s walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet authority that didn't need words. Dressed in a plain gray hoodie, dark jeans, and worn boots, he looked like any ordinary traveler, but there was something about his calm presence that made people instinctively step aside. His name was Daniel, Harold and Margaret's only son. He had just returned from a deployment overseas, taking a short break before rejoining his team. His parents didn't know he would be visiting that day. He wanted to surprise them, maybe share a meal, laugh a little, remind them that despite his long absences, he was still their boy. But as he entered the diner, the smile he'd been wearing slowly faded. He noticed the overturned glass, the sticky brown liquid spreading across the table, soaking his mother's dress. He saw the way his father's hand shook slightly as he held a napkin, pretending it didn't bother him. And then he saw the group of young men still chuckling under their breath, exchanging smug looks. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, a silent storm brewing behind calm seas. Margaret looked up and gasped softly, her face lighting up despite the mess around her. "Danny," she whispered, her voice breaking between surprise and relief. Harold turned, eyes widening as he saw his son standing there. "Son," he said quietly, "you're home." Daniel walked to their table in slow, steady steps, his gaze briefly meeting his mother's tearful eyes before shifting to the bullies. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to demand respect. Harold tried to dismiss it. "It's nothing, son, just a little accident." But Daniel could read the truth in his father's expression. Years in the military had taught him to see through lies, to read a room, to know when fear or shame hid behind politeness. He noticed the Coke dripping from the edge of the table, the young man still holding an empty glass, and the faint smirk that hadn't quite disappeared from his face. Without another word, Daniel reached for a napkin and began wiping his father's jacket, slow, deliberate movements. "No accident," he said softly, never taking his eyes off the boy who had done it. The air in the diner grew heavy. Conversation stopped. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed to hum quieter. The bullies shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering to one another. There was something unsettling about the man standing before them, not angry, not loud, just composed. dangerous in his stillness. Daniel finished cleaning his father's sleeve, folded the napkin, and placed it on the table. Then he straightened up, his voice calm and clear. "You owe them an apology." He said that it wasn't a request. It was a command, one that carried the weight of every mission, every lesson, every ounce of discipline that had shaped him into the man he was. The laughter died instantly. For the first time, the group realized they hadn't just embarrassed an old couple. They had crossed paths with someone who truly understood strength.story by pure hub kindness. The air in the diner felt thick enough to touch. The clinking of forks, the low hum of the ceiling fan, everything seemed to stop at once. The young men, moments ago full of laughter and mockery, now sat stiff in their seats. Daniel stood just a few feet away, his calm expression unchanging, his eyes sharp and unreadable. There was no shouting, no visible anger, just a silence that carried more weight than 1,000 threats. The ringleader, the same tall boy who had poured the Coca-Cola, leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his unease with arrogance. "Apology," he said with a forced chuckle. "It was just a joke. Man, no one got hurt." His friends nodded quickly, murmuring in agreement, though their voices trembled slightly. Daniel didn't blink. "You think humiliation is a joke?" he asked quietly. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like thunder wrapped in velvet. "You think it's funny to laugh at the people who built the world you're living in?" The boy rolled his eyes. "Relax, it's not that serious." That was when Daniel took a slow step forward. Then another. The floorboards creaked softly under his boots. "You're right," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's not serious. Until someone teaches you what respect looks like." The boy opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. Something about Daniel's stance, the perfect balance of his posture, the way his shoulders squared naturally, his hands steady and relaxed, sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't dealing with some random guy. This man had training, real training. The other customers in the diner watched in silence, eyes wide. The waitress, frozen near the counter, clutched her notepad nervously. Harold and Margaret sat still, their hearts pounding. Margaret reached out as if to calm her son, but she stopped herself. She knew that look, the one Daniel had when he needed to right a wrong. Daniel moved closer until he was standing right beside the bully's table. He bent slightly, his eyes level with the young man's. "You poured a drink on my father," he said softly. "You insulted my mother. You laughed while they sat in silence. So, here's what you're going to do. You're going to look at them, and you're going to say you're sorry." The bully laughed nervously, trying to appear "Or what, you gonna hit me?" Daniel's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something colder. "No," he said, straightening up. "I don't hit people who don't know better, but I do teach lessons." The words sent a shiver through the table. One of the boys muttered under his breath, "Let's just go, man." But the leader, too proud to back down, stayed still. He met Daniel's eyes again, and what he saw there wasn't rage. It was control, precision, power, wrapped in calm. The kind of calm that only comes from a man who's walked through fire and returned without flinching. And in that moment, the young man's laughter finally died for good. Story by pure hub kindness. For a moment, no one breathed. The diner, once filled with laughter and the clatter of plates, was frozen in a strange, electric stillness. The ringleader stared up at Daniel, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. His friends exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to stay seated or get up and run. The waitress stood near the counter, one hand pressed against her chest. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower. Then, breaking the silence, the young man smirked, that same arrogant grin he had worn when he dumped the Coke on Harold. "You think I'm scared of you?" he said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite sound genuine. "This isn't the army, tough guy. You can't order people around here." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at the boy, then at the reflection of his parents in the diner window, his father still trying to stay composed, his mother holding back tears. That was enough. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy stood, puffing out his chest, trying to look fearless. But the difference between false confidence and true strength was about to become painfully clear. Daniel's voice dropped lower, calm as ever. "Son, this isn't about fear. It's about respect, something you'll understand one day." And before anyone could react, Daniel reached out, grabbed the bully's wrist, and with one smooth, controlled motion, guided it down to the table. The move was effortless, fluid, and fast, a display of precision born from years of discipline. The boy winced, his smirk disappearing instantly as pain shot up his arm. Daniel didn't twist or hurt him. He simply applied enough pressure to make a point. The entire diner gasped. Chairs creaked, forks paused mid-air. Daniel's eyes locked onto the young man's. "Now," he said quietly, "you're going to apologize. Not because you're scared, but because it's the right thing to do." The boy's friends began stammering, "Hey man, it was just a joke. We didn't mean anything by it." But Daniel didn't even glance at them. His focus never wavered. The ringleader tried to pull his hand free, but it was no use. The strength holding him wasn't angry, it was unshakable. Then came a softer voice. "Daniel," Harold said, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. His touch was light, but filled with meaning. "It's enough, son. You've made your point." Daniel hesitated, his breathing steady but deep. Slowly, he released the young man's wrist. The boy stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his face pale and humiliated. For a long second, Daniel just looked at him, not with hatred, but disappointment. "You're lucky," he said calmly. "My father taught me better than to fight anger with anger." The ringleader swallowed hard, guilt finally cracking through his pride. I'm sorry," he muttered, barely audible. Then louder, looking at Harold and Margaret. "I'm sorry, sir." "Ma'am?" Daniel gave a small nod, stepping back. The bullies gathered their things quickly, their bravado completely gone. They walked out of the diner without another word, their laughter replaced by shame and silence. The room exhaled collectively. The waitress whispered, "Thank God," while Harold simply smiled faintly and said, "Let's just finish our lunch." But inside, Margaret's eyes shone with pride, not because her son had shown strength, but because he had shown restraint. Story by pure hub kindness. The glass door of the diner swung shut behind the group of young men, the sound echoing like the closing of a chapter. For a long moment, the room remained quiet, as though everyone needed time to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, life returned. The low hum of conversation began again, a few people murmuring words like "good for him" and "they deserved that." The waitress exhaled. Setting down her tray with shaky hands, Daniel stood still, his heartbeat finally slowing. He looked down at his parents, Harold carefully folding his napkin, trying to hide the tremor in his hand, and Margaret gently patting her dress dry with the last of the paper towels. The Coke stains were still there, but somehow, they no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet dignity that had returned to their faces. Harold looked up, meeting his son's eyes. "You didn't have to do that, son," he said softly. His voice was calm, but behind it was something deeper, gratitude mixed with pride. "We've dealt with worse." Daniel smiled faintly, pulling up a chair beside them. "Maybe," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." Margaret reached across the table, taking her son's hand in hers. "You've always been our protector, Danny, even when you were little." Her eyes glistened with tears, but her smile was warm. "Your father was right. You learned respect, and you gave it back to the world, even when it didn't deserve it." Daniel looked at his parents, their wrinkles, their strength, their quiet grace, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: peace. "Everything I've ever done," he said softly, "was because of what you taught me. You showed me how to stand tall without hurting others." Just then, the waitress approached, her eyes moist. "Sir," she said to Daniel, her voice trembling, "thank you not just for what you did here, but for how you did it. We need more people like you in this world." Daniel shook his head gently. "We need more kindness," he replied. "The rest will follow." The waitress nodded and left, smiling through her tears. A few of the other diners raised their cups slightly, a silent gesture of respect. Harold chuckled under his breath. "Looks like we got free refills and a show." They all laughed quietly, the tension slowly melting away. The family finished their meal, the simple joy of being together, filling the air with something warm and pure. As they rose to leave, Daniel placed a few bills under the check, nodding at the waitress. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the parking lot in gold. The wind was cool, carrying the faint sound of birds across the highway. Daniel walked between his parents, one hand lightly on his mother's shoulder, the other holding the diner door for his father. Margaret looked up at him and said softly, "Your father used to tell you, real strength doesn't need to shout." Daniel smiled, glancing back at the diner one last time. "He was right," he said. "It just needs to stand up when others stay quiet." As they walked away together, the old couple side by side with their son, the soldier who had fought battles both seen and unseen, there was no anger left, only peace. The lesson had been taught, not with fists, but with character. And the world, even if just that diner-sized corner of it, felt a little kinder that day. Story by Pure Hub Kindness.